Hi, it's good to see you. I was asked if I was really coming in spite of a vacation after Easter. I said yes, I will. I'm a medical doctor specialized in occupational and environmental medicine, and I have now a professorship in occupational and environmental medicine. And it's a position which is shared with a position at the County Council, Stockholm Läns Landsting, as head of a clinical department of occupational and environmental medicine. I felt the title getting inspired by a professor rather demanding. So I thought that what I could really stand up for is that research is inspiring and that it inspires, that it opens doors to an inspiring life. That's what I feel is a reality. And I would like to start by describing some of the research I've been involved in, but also come into what has my career looked like and how have I navigated from a young to a senior researcher, and what is the possible advice I feel I could give, right or wrong, from that. And please feel free to ask whenever you want. So I started with asbestos, and that was actually just as a temporary position to come in and help with field investigation, a workplace investigation that the labor union demanded at a factory which had produced asbestos cement products for construction. They had done that since 1907, and they closed in 1977. The workers were exposed to asbestos throughout. No one really expected us to find much, but we found a lot. We found fibrosis of the lung, asbestosis. We found mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the mesothelium surrounding the lung. And we found lung cancer and also, of course, a lot of pleural thickening from the asbestos exposure. And what we found was that the workers had been insufficiently informed about the risks, but also that the regulations which existed and which the company had mainly complied with were not sufficient to protect the workers. So I think this is what I wrote my thesis on, but I think also in me I founded a sort of fundamental critique about having opinions about what is really there without taking a look. There were some ladies who really took a look already in 1899, and they had a formidable head, Dame Adelaide Anderson, who was the principal lady inspector of factories in the UK. And she established already in 1899 that asbestos was harmful to the lungs. But that knowledge was never fully implied until one could say the 70s in some countries, when it was banned. There were some efforts to reduce exposure in the 30s, but that was limited to those who just handled the raw fiber and not to everyone in the production. They just assumed that it wasn't dangerous if it was mixed with other material. They didn't take a look. They didn't really examine this, investigate it. They just assumed. And that's a deadly sin, to just assume that something is free of risk without proper investigation. Another field I've been into is looking at the health risks of being a hairdresser. It's an extremely attractive job to be a hairdresser. It's girls with very good marks who go into this education, and they really love their job. But it's full with chemical exposures, ergonomic challenges, and it's also very stressful to find a living because there are too many going into these jobs. It's 90% young females. They have no occupational safety tradition. And we wanted to know if they had an excess risk for asthma and eczema. Eczema is pretty well known, but asthma wasn't really known. But we saw a lot of patients coming with asthma who were hairdressers and experienced that the symptoms were triggered by work, and especially by the persulfates, the things you use to make the hair blonde. But they wanted to know if it would harm the fetuses, if it was harmful for reproduction. And we also wanted to know how they experienced quality of life, because they tended to stay in their jobs, although they had a lot of symptoms. They would do everything to stay. So one thing we looked into was cancer, because hairdressing work is classified as probably carcinogenic to humans. But it's unclear if that's due to what the hair coloring agents used to be like, or if this is a risk which remains. So we monitored long-term exposure by looking at adducts to hemoglobin in the blood of metabolites of the coloring agents. And we also looked at sources of exposure. This is an advertising picture from one of the firms producing hair coloring agents. And we found that actually they are exposed to orthotoluidine, which is an established bladder carcinogen. This is a contaminant in the hair dyes, and it supports some earlier findings which has been done in Turkey. So we found that there is both a need for safety measures at the workplace for the hairdressers to protect themselves properly until the hair dyes are safe, but it's also a need to really look into these products and make sure that they don't contain these contaminants, which really shouldn't be there. Now I'm more concerned about a broader perspective, and that is if work is sustainable and if it's developing in a sustainable direction. Sustainability is much discussed with regard to the outdoor environment, the general environment, but not so much with regard to work. And sustainability is something which has to do with being able to keep up, to support, to carry, to withstand weight or pressure, but also to use a resource so that it's not depleted or permanently damaged. And if we look at this in the context of work, it's like a 40 plus years longitudinal aspect of sustainability. We go into working life around age 25, 27. We're supposed to remain at least until 67, so maybe it's quite a long time. And age changes us. We are not better or worse when we are young or old in working life, but we are different. Our strengths and weaknesses are different. Life events happen, and we should be able to remain in working life, although very sad things may happen in our private lives and put stress on us. We need to develop our skills so that we are employable 40 years after we entered the labor market, and don't stop developing our skills. And we need to remain productive, because otherwise who wants to pay our salary in the long run? So I think that sustainability is there for a large part of the labor market, but there are also parts where it's clearly unsustainable. We need to look at work that promotes health. Although we have a very strong influence of globalization, which influences our traditional way of managing the labor market a lot. Because our system is that the state makes a sort of framework, which is very crude, and then the social partners, the labor unions and the employers agree on all the details in their agreements, and that they are usually industry specific. And in that way, everyone thinks that you can adapt better to the need and the situation of that specific industry. But if you now have globalization with a lot of labor which is not organized and a lot of employment which is not organized, employers who are not organized, this changes rules. So you will have some sectors where the old system works and other sectors where it definitely doesn't. And also the platform economy, for instance, is something which is not, this system is not created for. Our old system is not created to deal with this. We also have an increasing diversity in health or inequality in health. And I'll come back to this. This means that the fit between the individual and the work is challenged for some groups. And also everyone has to work longer to keep their retirement benefits. In my generation, we have to work until 67 to get the same benefits as my partner got at 65. And that will go upwards. So there's better health overall in the population, but the divide is increasing. And this is a figure from the Swedish National Commission on Inequalities and Health, which I was a member. And this is the remaining life expectancy from age 30 by education. And this is if you have just the 9 years of school, grundskola. This is if you have upper secondary. This is if you have tertiary, which is like university. And you see that the life expectancy is really going up very well and very quick for those with long education. It's also not bad for upper secondary, but for basic, very little is happening. If you look at this figure instead for men, you will see it's slightly nicer for men with just basic education. But still, you see this widening gap, although overall it's really a success story. But this means that at a given age, the difference in health status within the population is now greater than it used to be, even though the good news is that on average it's better. And this is something that the individual workplace then has to deal with. So it can't be one size fits all anymore. And it can be up to the individual to fix this adaptation, this fit between the work and the individual. And there are lots of people who experience that work demands more of them than they really can, than their capacity, what's their real capacity. And this is something which we know is predictive of early exit. And we know that heavy physical work may be responsible for something like 1/5 of the disability pensions in males, and maybe 1/3 in women. And this is just to see what the proportion is of people who report that the physical demands of work exceeds their capacity in different municipalities in the county of Stockholm or different parts of Stockholm city. So you see in Norrtälje, it's 32% of the men who were of working age and in work who answered the public health questionnaire who said that work was too heavy for them. But if you go to Norrmalm, it's like 4%. And this is heavily associated with length of education. You see a bit of the same pattern for women, but not as steep with social gradient. And this is because heavy physical work goes with higher education in caring occupations. So I just listed here some occupations where people report that either the physical demands or the mental demands clearly exceed their capacity. So you can see it's like 1/4 or 1/3 of cleaners, both male and female, which say that both physical and mental demands exceed their capacity. And kitchen workers, construction workers, you also see like 1/5, nurses 1/5, teachers 1/5 when it comes to mental demands. Because we know this is predictive of early retirement and long sick leave, this is really troublesome. And it means work is not sustainable in these industries. And we can also see that those who manage to work until age 65 are very few in sales and services, elementary occupations. In low-skilled work, it's like 40% maybe, while in those jobs which demand higher education or have more of a manager position, corporate managers, engineering science professionals, it's like 65 to 70% who manage to work until age 65 in their work. So the issues I think I can see is that we have a rapidly changing labor market which challenges our current systems for worker safety. And these changes are not monitored. We don't really have a common shared view of what's going on because we're not monitoring it. And if we don't have that common ground of what's actually happening, we can't agree on what should be done. So I think this is deeply problematic. And we also don't know which approaches to worker safety are really efficient in this new context for those new sectors which are growing and which do not have the traditional structures for worker safety. So we decided we wanted to look into what is happening. And we wanted to know if multiple disadvantages are accumulating in specific sectors of working life, like maybe both exposure to chemicals, physically heavy work, and mentally stressful work. So we wanted to look at the effects, both with regard to health, but also work participation. And we wanted to know what works, both in terms of regulatory framework, but also sort of softer law or just forming knowledge alliances. If the social partners get to know what we know, will they then maybe take the measures which are necessary without a law forcing them to do it? We wanted to investigate this in a systematic way. But we found our research environment was okay with these questions, but not with governance. We needed extra people in there, extra competencies, and I'll show you what we've got. So we have a new research program now, which is funded for 2017 to 2022, which looks into the exposure in different jobs and how it's developing. We try to capture all exposures we can, physical, chemical, mental, but also employment conditions, and describe tendencies and what it looks like for each occupation. And we can do this by linking the assessment we make for each occupational title to a national registry called LISA, where you have the occupational title for everyone year by year. We want to see what's happening to people's work participation and health, and do this in a life course perspective. If you've had a really tough job for 30 years, and then you go into a job which is okay, how much sort of scarring are you taking into your new decent job from those former working conditions? And a more practical way of framing that question is it sufficient if we, for instance, reduce the physical workload for those who are 55 plus, or do we need to reduce it throughout? in order not to harm people's resources and ability to work. We are looking at the workers' compensation system, at public procurement, public tenders, upphandlingar, and we are looking at what can be done to improve the work inspectorate with regard to really identifying the workplaces with high risk by using very new technology. We are working together with Royal Institute of Technology here in Stockholm. And then we work closely with the social partners and with the municipality to see what can be achieved just by having a dialogue and the knowledge which is there, the methods which are there, and see if they implement it and if it's successful. So let's see. Now I'm losing my time. Sorry, a bit. A time perspective seems like, yeah. Okay. Pardon? Thank you. Thank you. So this is our job exposure matrix, which have like temperature, noise, vibration, particles, exposure, physical exposure, psychosocial stress. And we can and also if it's standard or non-standard employment we are trying to introduce here. So that way we can define each occupation with regard to these exposures. And then we can link that to Statistics Sweden, to age, sex, nationality, education, and we can describe what's happening overall in Sweden, but we can also relate it to different health outcomes. We form a cohort of everyone employed in Sweden between 1990 to 2020 who have a provisional residency. And we can look at what are different determinants, personal determinants, and we can see what happens to their work participation, what happens to their incomes, and what happens to their health. This, I think, is important because we now know that, for instance, myocardial infarction can be caused both by noise, exposure to particles, also by psychosocial stress. But we don't know to what extent people are exposed at the same time to these things so that they really get an unacceptably high risk. And we also don't know what happens if you have had a myocardial infarction and you go back to work with high noise levels, for instance, if your risk is then higher than those than for everyone else. And we are looking then on how can the institutional framework be tuned to be adapted to the new working life. So we work with vocational schools, we work with employer and trade union initiatives, and with local community implementations. And we have a researcher in law who is looking at public procurement, and we have a national economist looking at workers' compensation. And we use advanced algorithms for sharpening the selection of work sites to inspect. So we are the unit of occupational medicine at the Institute of Environmental Medicine here at KI, but we work then with Stockholm University with regard to labor economics and law, and the Royal Institute of Technology with computer science, and Gothenburg University for intervention research, And we have partners which are practitioners, and an international scientific advisory boards, which are really our critical friends, so that we make the best use of the resources we've got. And the future research perspectives, I think, is to have an even more integrated approach. Now, I've now spoken about work, but we have every reason to assume that there is an interaction between work and the built environment. We know, for instance, that if you have triggered a stress reaction, then you recover better if you are in green space. So we have every reason to assume that if you live in a place where you have good access to green space, you will recover better and be more resilient to work stress. And maybe it's the opposite. If you live in an environment which is noisy, which is unsafe, you are less resilient to stress. You are more vulnerable. And there's very little research looking into this, and we want to enter this gap. Commuting is also something which adds to your working days, gives you less days, less hours with your family, and there is now a substantial part of the population living under economic stress because there is austerity measures, so the welfare systems are less generous than they used to be. And this is also something which may contribute. So this was just mentioning the research we're doing, and I would just shortly say what have I done as a career and how did I navigate. So I started in occupational medicine. I wrote my thesis in '92. I became a docent or associate professor in '97. I was head of a clinical department. I then worked more with research and was coordinator of a Forte Center of Excellence for 10 years. I also worked with research evaluation and research policy and reports on evidence. And then I got this professorship here at the Karolinska together with being head of a unit. I have 2 children, and I would say that the first period up to '97, I didn't really navigate. I was just trying to find a role in this context. Then I found that I had a strength in interdisciplinary collaboration, and I also really enjoyed it. I also found that in Lund we were sometimes not competitive in our own environment, but if we made alliances or collaborations with other research environments, then we were really competitive and could, for instance, get a grant which would otherwise maybe have gone to Stockholm. So, and I had task as a leader. Then I felt that there was a glass ceiling when it came to applications, and also being an expert in some committees where or commissions where I would like to be, if you're not a professor. So I decided I wanted to be a professor. I also wanted to influence policy. So now I am a professor. I'm head of a clinical department and of a research the unit. And I've also worked with the National Commission on Social Inequalities in Health, which I felt was really a meaningful work. So if you want to interact with policy or not as a researcher, I think that depends on you. It can be a plight, or it can be seen as a plight or as a privilege. But if you like it, I think you can make really a lot of good. And I think it can be very satisfactory to inform policy with key evidence. And I think it's important that we also speak up when there really is enough evidence to take action. But when there are people saying that there's always some doubt, there's always something we don't know, but then you have to say, well, that's true, but we know enough to take action. So independent researchers have a very important role in that. But how much you do this, I think that's up to you, what suits you. And I think the advice I would like to give that there are many types of researchers. There are many types of successful researchers also. So just don't have to be like the one who was your teacher. You can be like someone else. You should find your own positive driving force and identify your strengths. Networks, at least in my discipline, it's key to everything. So build networks and start building networks early. And you will also get a trademark as a researcher, and be careful about that because it's important, and learn from the best. I think selecting collaborators which you enjoy working with and which you trust is really important. And I don't believe in keeping ideas to yourself. I believe in discussing them with others. And I think finding solutions to job-family conflicts is possible, but you have to be aware of them and work with them. So you have one life, you're resourceful, think about what is important. Maybe you want to do a career as a researcher. Maybe you want to impact society. Maybe you want to have your focus on teaching, and that's quite all right. But research opens all those doors to you. And you can achieve more than you thought. And it's involving and it's rewarding to be in research. But don't let it engulf you. Think about other things and plans so they get a space in your life too. That's what I would like to say. Thank you.